What's up, guys? I'm Luke Dziados, a pitching trainer here at Driveline Baseball, and I'm with Dylan Newcomer, who is our physical therapist, and I'm also joined with Josh Hejka, who is.
You were close on that pronunciation. That was close.
You can elaborate.
Last name is Josh Hejka. To be fair, I don't think I can pronounce your last name either.
Yeah, that was the first time I've heard it said it correctly.
That's okay.
But I am a R&D intern here, and I also train here, and I'm a current minor league pitcher with the New York Mets.
Yeah, and as Luke said, my name is Dylan Newcomer. I am the physical therapist here on site at the Seattle location for Driveline, and I am the one that helps run and coordinate athletes through the rehab process and the return to throws, which is going to be our main topic for today, which is kind of the difference between the standard return to throw process as well as what we do a little bit differently, integrating some of our technology like Pulse and how we design the return to throw to integrate things like velocity and things of that sort to kind of advance the field forward in our eyes.
Cool. And just for a little context, Luke and I have both gone through the return to throw process. I had Tommy John in early 2023, went through that entire process here at Driveline with Dylan, and came out of that and had a healthy season this year. And Luke can talk about his background as well.
Yeah, I had surgery in 2021. Also chose to rehab it at Driveline. I kind of want to get into like what made you want to rehab it at Driveline, and like, did you understand any of the protocols that they did beforehand and like how they rehab their athletes, or were you kind of just like, I don't know much about this, and like I heard good things about Driveline?
Sure. Yeah. So I actually originally tore my UCL in 2020, and I felt a kind of a pop in my elbow when I was throwing a bullpen. And around that time, obviously the season was canceled due to COVID. And one of the things I wanted to do was try to avoid surgery if I could. So that's when I learned a lot about Pulse, and I started using Pulse to kind of inform my throwing workloads as I was trying to rehab in 2020. And using Pulse, I was able to basically build back up to where I was before throughout that missed season. And I basically was able to avoid surgery at that point. I continued using it through 2021, 2020, 2022. And at the end of the 2022 season, I felt my elbow kind of start flaring up again. And around that time, I was like, maybe I can try to go through the rehab process again. So I knew Driveline was, I had never trained with Driveline before, but I knew Driveline was, data-driven, like thought leaders in the industry. So I called Dylan and I basically said, like, here's the situation. If possible, I'd like to avoid surgery and try to build back up for next season. So I actually came out here for a few months. And throughout that time, I just learned so much through Dylan, and basically through the way that Driveline, handles not just the rehab process, but the training process. And I was essentially hooked. The data-driven aspect, and as we'll get into some of the more specific aspects of like the rehab and the return to throw process. But unfortunately, my UCL was fully torn, and we basically decided the best thing for me in my career was to go through a surgery. And that entire year was so insightful and such a great learning process that I think, that time with Dylan, that I'm really glad I ended up coming back here and doing the rehab process. But that time is going to set me up so well for the rest of my career, just from understanding my body and understanding my arm in a much better way than I did before. But it was kind of spontaneous, but it ended up being one of the best decisions I've ever made.
Gotcha. So I kind of have a question based off of that answer that you gave, but the question is more so for Dylan. Mm-hmm. And Josh, feel free to jump in. Mm-hmm. You made a point that like you wanted to avoid surgery, right? I feel that the narrative out there is like, oh, Tommy John, or whatever surgery we want to talk about, like will help you either become a better baseball player, throw harder, get you where you want to go. What kind of goes into the factor of like surgery is the best route here, and then also to like why avoid surgery if like in the end game it's just like inevitable?
Yeah, I think I'll jump on the first part of your question, which was like the narrative aspect that a lot of people carry. I've come across it quite a bit, is that, there's this thought process that somehow getting the surgery is the thing that allows you to have an improvement in performance. And that's fundamentally false. The surgery does repair the ligament. So yeah, if you've been battling a partially torn ligament, you're probably not performing at your best. The surgery does repair that or reconstruct it depending on the scenario, but you're basically starting from scratch. And the rehab process is kind of the make or break for whether you have a successful outcome or not. There are a lot of athletes who unfortunately don't receive a quality rehab, whether it's just due to access to somebody in their local area that has an expertise in Tommy John rehab, or what other factors be at play. An unsuccessful rehab will result in an unsuccessful return to throw and a long road to potentially never even making it back. I made a post the other day that there was a study in 2021 where even in MiLB, where athletes have the most access to resources, I think it was about 40% of the pitchers never made it back to their prior level of performance. And that's something I want to harp on, is that prior level of performance is different than return to play. If you've ever interacted with a surgeon that talks about Tommy John surgery, they probably tout that it's like a 90 to 99% success rate. But that is only measured by one successful pitch in a competitive outing, regardless of the velo or any other metrics that come along with that. If you've thrown a single competitive pitch, they count that as a success. You guys are athletes, and you guys know that in order for you to continue to progress in your career, being able to just throw one pitch isn't going to make it. Like, you've got to get to your prior level of performance and beyond that. So that's really the measure of success there. And so that study that I was referring to, they found that about 40% MLB pitchers never made it back, right? And then of the 60% that did, I believe it was about 10% or so never made it back to throw more than 100 pitches in a single season. So really, it was about a 50% success rate whenever you take into like actual performance. The surgery itself is not the thing that's saving you. It's everything that you do up to that point, the rehab that sets the foundation, and then the return to throw that builds the capacity to be able to get back to the point that you were before. And if those aren't meticulously managed, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure and a lot of frustration.
Absolutely. And something I just want to add on that is the point you made about, it's especially like someone in my shoes, who's minor league baseball player, like I'm fighting for a job every single season. It's not enough coming out of that rehab process. And it wouldn't have been enough for me to come back the exact same player I was before, because everybody else had a year of development and a year of getting better. When I didn't. So for me, one of my main goals of the rehab process was not, I just want to be healthy. I just want to be the same pitcher I was before. My goal is to come out of it like a much better pitcher and a much better player than I was before. And throughout the rehab process, we had that end goal in mind. It's like, it's not just get healthy. The goal is, use this as a year of development, and like, in what ways can I, so for example, when, the 6 months before my return to throw, what ways can I set myself up to be better and stronger and more physically capable once I do start my return to throw? And even throughout my return to throw, like, not taking it for granted that, I'm just like, going through the motions and throwing just to put stress on my elbow, but like, in what ways can we be creative about putting stress on my elbow, where the stress is still the same, but we're able to do things mechanically that like will have payoffs as I get further along the return to throw process. And, through that process, my average velo was up 2 miles an hour this season. I was a much better pitcher than I was before. So it was a resounding success.
I think you set an all-time appearance record as well.
The most appearances of my career was within 2 or 3 innings of the most innings in my career, and had like the 15 or 20 hardest pitches in my career this season. So it was all due to the fact that we had that as a focus of my return to throw and my rehab process as a whole. And I think that's something that a lot of people miss, is that it's not just good enough to be like the same pitcher you were before that process happens.
Right. I think the big takeaway from the question I had was like, surgery might fix you, but it doesn't make you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Josh, going back to before you started throwing, you did your rehab with Dylan, or you did your rehab just like with any physical therapy clinic?
So the way the Mets, so after I had surgery, I went down to Florida for about a week until I had to get my stitches out. And then the Mets were like, what we typically do is send guys home during this period, just because it's pretty straightforward, like what you're going to be doing. And we just have a lot of guys here. So like as your process becomes more involved, we'll have you come back. But for now you can go home. And for me, I'm like, well, if I'm going to go home, I'm not going to just go home to like whatever random PT guys are in, Dearborn, Michigan. I was like, if I'm going to go somewhere that's not here, I want to go to the best place in the world. And from my prior experience with Dylan, I was like, I know I want this guy to run my rehab process. And it started out not knowing exactly how long I would be here or how long the Mets would let me stay here. With how well things were going and how fast I was progressing, they essentially let me stay here for the vast majority of my rehab and my return to throw process. Which I'm extremely grateful for, that they allowed me to take that ownership of my own career and do what I thought was best for me. But yeah, it was essentially that entire foundation was laid in person with Dylan every single day. And I think that's part of the reason why I made it through the return to throw process and my first season with 0 setbacks, no issues at all. It's because of the foundation we laid here every single day.
So off of that, what are some things that you look for to maybe train or regain in athletes that are coming off of, let's say specifically Tommy John surgery?
Yeah. Before I jump into that, I want to just kind of harp on or just knock on one point that he said. He mentioned that the Mets saw that he was progressing fast, and what I want to iterate is we still took the full 6 months, right? When we say fast, we don't necessarily mean that we're going to try and rush the timeline, because the 6 months after the surgery isn't about how fast we can get you back to throwing. It's about how much progress can we make, how much strength and power can we restore. And this what bleeds into your question, is that fundamentally, before you pick up a ball, if you have not restored maximum strength, your power outputs, your endurance capacity, things along those lines of both like the global tissues, your global movement patterns, as well as like the specific structures of the forearm and the rotator cuff, then you're fundamentally setting yourself up for failure, because you're not even the same physical status that you were but when you got hurt. So why would you start throwing on that? Right? And so in the rehab process, we want to try to be as safely aggressive as possible. We're never going to put them in a place of compromise or harm where we might damage the graft or the structural integrity of the surgery. But in my opinion, surgeries are the rehab protocol for Tommy John is often understressed, undertrained. And athletes, and you know this from going back to the Mets and kind of seeing some of your friends that were way behind you at the same timeline. Like you had restored your full maximal strength, and you were stronger actually than you were pre-surgery by the time you started throwing. There's a phrase that I like to use, which is, I want to restore the physiology before we start focusing on the neurology. And what I mean by that is, like, physiologically, adaptations take a long time, continued stress, continued training. Well, the first 2.5 months are all about restoring range of motion and just getting a baseline training capacity. You want to give yourself at least 2 to 4 months of consistent hard training to really restore the physiology of your body, the structural tissue, the strength, the power, and all of that before we start layering on the skill component of throwing. Because then if we can pull back on the physiology and maintain it, we can pull back the training and reduce the stress load there, but maintain those qualities and continue to make subtle progress, then it allows us to stress the throwing a little bit more. Sure. And then on the other side of that, we have, just the return to throw itself being very meticulously managed. But
and there's 2 things that I want to add on to that I think we did extremely well. And I think a lot of times when you look at a calendar, there's obviously the calendar of like a return to throw or a rehab process. There's some good reasons for waiting sometimes, right? Like the graft needs to heal. Like there's some actually like good reasons for like why certain things take so much longer than other things. But a lot of it is arbitrary in the sense that, like, once the graft is healed, at least correct me if I'm wrong, Dylan, but like once the graft is healed, like obviously you can progress things too quickly, but there's not necessarily a reason to like, wait 20 weeks to start bench pressing or 15 weeks to start bench pressing. So I think 2 things that we did really well. One was understanding like what what timelines were required due to the actual like healing of the graft. But outside of that, asking the body some questions and saying like, okay, is my body physically prepared to handle this movement? And that doesn't mean like, you know, we're going to start bench pressing 50 pounds like in week 3. No, of course not. But what I did do, and I think you remember this very well, is, you know, even when I was still in my brace, I would have a yellow plyo ball in my hand, less than a pound. And I'd be like moving through these ranges of motion, number one, so they don't atrophy. So yeah, obviously we're not necessarily like gaining strength in this sense, but like we're trying to remind my body that these are movements that are important. We're not like letting the body atrophy these movements. So not only do like, if I waited 15, 20 weeks to start doing this, my body would have almost forgotten how to do this movement. I would have lost a lot of the strength. And that brings me to the analogy that Adam Moreau actually came up with when I was speaking to him a few weeks ago. And it's this concept of you want the progression to look more like a plane taking off and less like a helicopter. And what I mean by that is, as you're progressing a certain movement or a certain pattern, you don't want to go from doing it not at all to like instantly, doing it at a high level.
The stress, just like the vertical takeoff of like a helicopter.
Exactly. Every step should be like a very subtle progression of the step before it. And usually the way we can do that is by lengthening the left tail and like starting it so early at a very low intensity. So like I said, we started my bench press progression with a fucking yellow plyo ball. Like it wasn't, we're less than a pound, right? Like it's not actually doing any stress, but it's much easier to progress. And that same philosophy of like the plane taking off, the gradual progression, it applied to my throwing as well, right? Like it's not like I went from not experiencing any valgus torque at all to immediately starting to throw it and experiencing like fairly high levels of valgus torque. No, we slowly built myself into it using internal rotation isometrics by throwing heavier balls beforehand to like slowly prepare my arm at low levels of torque.
And we did
where basically
the
each step
stuff and everything.
Exactly, the flywheel exercises for valgus torque, and each step is a very, very subtle, slow progression from the one before it, to the point where like throwing a baseball wasn't even that big of a deal for me because it was such a small step from the previous step. It wasn't this big momentous day where I'm like, wow, I'm finally getting to experience valgus torque in my arm again. No, it was like a very small step forward. And I think for both of those reasons, we were able to make it through the rehab process with like 0 setbacks. And I always felt like the door was opening for me, and rather than me trying to kick down the door. Like it felt like I was always over prepared for what I was about to do. And it was great.
Kind of reemphasizing that you could progress the movements early on, that left tail of the graph that you're referring to. Like every single day you came in and you did just a little bit more, right? We kept the patterns relatively the same. We knew that at the end of the rehab, I needed you to be able to do things like bench press, pull-ups, whatever it may be. I needed you to be able to do a shot put with a med ball at a really high intent, explosive landmine presses, all of that. You take those same movement patterns that you're going to work into at the end stage of the rehab, and you regress it all the way down to the most simplest, lowest load form, and you draw out that progression scheme as long as possible, and that helps you just easily restore the pattern. I don't know if you remember, but I think by like week 16, which is a lot of time whenever people start being allowed to do some basic weight training, you were already like at 80 or 90 pound dumbbells.
I think week 16, I was hitting 100s or 105. I was like PRing in dumbbell bench press in like week 15 or 16.
Yeah, and I remember
pretty crazy.
You went down to the Mets and they kind of lost their shit a little bit. It was kind of funny.
They were, it's more so, it's not that they necessarily lost their shit, but it's just like, I think sometimes there's this fear that like by pushing a guy, like he might have a setback or a flare up, right? And I think what people need to realize is that like it's okay to like have these like small flare ups and stuff early on if you're like pushing guys into these movements. And I didn't have any flare ups, but like if you don't prepare the guy, so like for example, I've seen some people who have gone through a rehab process and they're throwing pretty high intensity and they still cannot bench or row the same amount with their injured arm as their not injured arm. And so, that guy is probably never going to have a flare up during his rehab process because he's not being stressed at all. But what you are doing is setting him up to have a catastrophic setback during his return to throw because he's just frankly unprepared for the demands of throwing. And so like taking that, like being a little bit more, and the idea of like compounding interest, right? Like every little thing you do at the beginning of your rehab process that like allows you to prevent some atrophy or allows you to like keep a certain movement pattern trained in your body, like you're going to have like compounding gains over the course of time.
Yeah.
Versus if you don't do those things at all, like you're just going to have a guy who's like, yeah, he made it through the rehab process, never had any issues, but it's because you never challenged him. And now he's throwing and he can't even bench the same amount with his right arm as he can with his left. Like that guy is not in a position where he's going to stay healthy for a long period of time. Just because his arm's not even, or if he is, like he's probably not going to be able to perform to the same level, or as we talked about before, better than he was pre-injury, just because he's not actually prepared for the demands of throwing.
Yeah. And not to say that we've been using the bench press a lot, not to say that the bench press is some magical exercise, but it is just it's a proxy measure of like your global strength of your arm. And that really applied to all of the exercises that we went through. Absolutely. Both are, when I say global, I mean like your bench presses, your rows, your chin-ups, things like that. But we also focus really specifically on, the specific muscle tendon units of the forearm, and the rotator cuff and the scap and all that. Like all of that matters. But we're just kind of referring to this global idea that you are not the same athlete when you're entering the return to throw that you were when you got injured. You're actually less, and that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, well, I kind of want to get into two things here. Talking about setbacks a little bit. Mm-hmm. So, kind of the second thing I want to get into is more so why does pulse and velocity-based measurements within return to throws allow us to limit setbacks? But more so, I have a very vivid memory when doing my return to throw about like a pretty major setback that I had due to the fact that like I personally thought I was ready to throw at a much higher intensity than was granted for the day. And like I want to talk about that more, but my question to you for now is like, did you have any, like, when I say major setbacks, like, did you have any setbacks that like set you back a couple weeks or anything like that? He
did, but it was nothing to do with his arm.
Yeah, it was. It was because I was sick and like basically had to stop training for a couple of weeks.
Well, you also did the unspoken rule of lifting before you sprint, and then he strained his hamstring a little bit, so we had to navigate that for a week or two.
At the same time, I was sick.
So it wasn't an arm injury.
Okay. It was. You were home visiting some friends at a Michigan training site, and you got challenged to a sprint.
I sprinted pre-lift as I usually do.
Yeah,
and then I did my lift, which included a hamstring workout. And then they busted out the laser timers. And I was like, oh, like what's a couple more like flying tens?
Yeah, fatigue, buddy. That's the difference.
After, a full sprint session and a lift session. And of course you tweaked my hamstring. But outside of that, and I didn't have any issues. And I think, I can let Dylan talk about this a little bit too. But I think the main reason is because number one, I was so physically prepared through my rehab process. But it's like what you alluded to of using the velocity and the pulse-based progression, which I'll let Dylan talk about. But the main reason I think that's so successful is because you're basically you're progressing things in such an intelligent and intentional way. When former return to throw programs, or like a lot of these common ones that use distance, or even just like number of throws. Like, so what's the reason we use distance on a throwing program? It's because it's a proxy for how much stress you're actually putting on your arm. It's not that there's anything special about throwing a ball 90 feet or 120 feet or 150 feet. It's that going further tends to put more stress on your arm.
Right. Distance has no, like there is no distance to be like measured for intensity, right? Mm-hmm. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, it's intended to be used as the intensity progression,
right?
But there's multiple faults that come with that. The first one, and I'll just kind of use your standard bell curve is like a good way to kind of visualize this, right? If you've looked at like a bell curve with the standard deviations of the population that completes an average task, right? If you think about like perfect execution on a just standard doctor printed off template of a return to throw, and that 50% part is the person that did it exactly right. You've already got a standard deviation above and a standard deviation below. That's 68% of your total athletes that are going to be either one standard deviation above overshooting, one standard deviation below undershooting, right? And then you go 2 and 3 to get your full population. So you've got a good amount of athletes that are going to overshoot the intended, intensity of those distances, and a good amount of athletes that are going to undershoot. Those guys that overshoot are probably going to be the ones that have repetitive setbacks. The guys that undershoot are going to be the guys that whenever they finally get to the mound, they're not going to be throwing very hard, or they're going to make a massive jump at that point and have a setback.
The helicopter.
Right. And so without any kind of objective true intensity measure that they can use week to week, you're kind of leaving just a lot of this up to feel and guesswork. And within that one standard deviation, that 68%, maybe they're successful, right? Maybe they were just a little hot or just a little low, but in the end, they're ultimately successful. But the wider out on those standard deviation charts you go, the more likely you're dealing with athletes that didn't have a successful return to throw. And so really pulse and velocity, the goal there is just to simply make it much more detailed and guided and specific to you. Because if you throw 95 and if you throw 85, right? And
the 50% is
50%.
Yes.
Yeah. Like a lot of them will say, get on the mound and throw 50%. Well, anybody that's actually ever executed one of those knows that they're not asking you to throw 47.5 miles an hour and you to throw 37.5, right? They're just saying throw at a rough RPE of 50%, which maybe you're throwing at 95% of your pre-injury velo because that's 50% for you.
Right, sure.
Maybe you're throwing at 70% of that, right? And so you get this really wide variance. Versus if I give you a specific pulse and velocity progression and every step of the way you're hitting your milestones, by the time that you get to the mound, and normally I have guys get on the mound at around 70 to 75% of their pre-injury velo, like you get on the mound and then week over week, you know that you're going to make just a subtle increase. There is no big jumps here. We're smoothing out that progression, just like the airplane analogy from earlier. And that's really the big key. We don't want large jumps and large spikes of intensity, especially as we approach the tail end, the top end of the velocity, because we know that getting throws at like 45, 50 miles an hour, the torque that's induced there is not just half of something thrown twice as hard, right? The closer you get to higher and higher velocities, the stress on the arm is exponentially higher, right? And so we don't want to make big jumps at the tail end. We want to have actually smaller and smaller incremental jumps once we get there. And that's what the velocity and the pulse progressions allows us to do. Really the velocity on that front, and the pulse is really serving in the back end to monitor your workload, which is kind of a proxy of both the volume you're doing at those levels. And so we can get really, really specific, manipulate the variables to have a very specific outcome and a very specific intensity progression that ensures everything is still within a safe limits and we don't have these harsh spikes that could set you up for a setback.
And I think you talked a lot about intensity there, but I think something that you really imposed on me throughout the entire return to throw process. So something you taught me was that there's essentially like 4 or 5 different things we want to progress throughout the entire return to throw process. We want to progress how much volume your arm can handle, how much intensity your arm can handle, how much volume you can handle at your peak intensity, at or near your peak intensity, and then how often you're throwing, the frequency of your throwing. And so something we did in our process, which we can use pulse and velocity to measure objectively, is we can basically set a standard for each of those 4 categories and then progress only one of them at a given time. So like maybe during a certain block, I'm keeping the intensity very similar, but I'm actually progressing how much volume I can handle at that intensity. Or we're keeping the volume and the intensity the same, but now we're saying, we're going to move from 3 days a week of throwing to 4 days a week to 5 days. But we're basically manipulating one variable at a time. So then if we know something goes wrong, we know what was the cause and we know what to dial back to allow my body to recover quicker. Once again, we didn't need to do that for my process. I was extremely lucky, and I think it's because of the work we put in. But it allows you to have more control and intentionality with all the variables throughout your process. So like volume, like you alluded to, the proxy for volume is essentially either throw count or like the total workload on your arm that day. We could also look at, for intensity, we could look at arm speed or torque values on any given throw or throughout the course of the throwing day. For volume at peak intensity, we could look at how close were you to your peak intensity and how many throws did you make at that intensity. So just using pulse allows you to like actually measure all these things. And it's nothing's ever a guarantee that things are going to go great. But I think what pulse allows you to do is that if things don't go well, it allows you to, number one, figure out why it didn't go well. You can look back and say like exactly what happened. Did I move my intensity up too quickly? Did I move my volume up too quickly? And then number two, it allows you to create a plan to fix that, instead of just saying like, okay, I guess I'll take a week off and like see what happens. Like, no, it allows you to diagnose the root cause of the issue and then make a plan to actually fix the underlying cause. So
yeah,
that's what I love about it.
It's actually very, very, very helpful on a retrospective case as well. Like if, an athlete in gym that has been consistent with their pulse, suffers any form of a setback with their throwing or a painful episode, and we're curious as to like what caused it. And this is kind of what has led into our development of the SMART reports, is because athletes that didn't necessarily a couple years ago have a strong feel for like what pulse was telling them.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have to go in retrospectively and like analyze, oh, your recovery days suddenly turned all into hybrid B days. And your hybrid B days all suddenly turned into hybrid A days.
It's very common.
And so everyone was just overshooting, ton of fatigue build up, things like that. So pulse can be definitely used from that educational standpoint of like, how do you actually make your lows low, your highs high, and like, how do you balance those two?
Mm-hmm.
And that applies to not just return to throws, but just everyday throwing programs. But I think Bodie alluded to it on one of the previous podcasts where it can also be utilized for the performance end. And you do this now where you know how much workload that you need to accumulate throughout a week. Mm-hmm. And you get to make the decisions on what you think is the most valuable for you to allocate high amounts of workload to. And then, whenever you're running a little bit high on your ACWR and your acute to chronic workload ratio, when you need to pull back for a day or two and give yourself time to recover, because you've invested so much time into understanding the product and understanding the information that it can tell you, so that you can leverage it to maximize your performance in your throwing program now after you finish the return to throw.
I'd like to jump into the psychological aspect of return to throws. When I was like doing my program from the previous physical therapist, mm-hmm. the intensity in which like I had my setback at, I completely blew it out of the water. I walked in the gym and I like predetermined like I was going to hit 90 today, and like the benchmark was 85. And so I'm like doing a couple pull downs. I'm like, I feel great. All the other athletes are like, Jesus Christ, like you shouldn't be throwing this hard. But I'm like, no, like I should definitely be throwing this hard. And I was like hopping up on the mound, and I was just constantly sitting 89. Mm-hmm. And I remember Jackson Sigmund, like he's like, you're just gonna flirt with it all day, and I couldn't hit 90 for the life of me. And from that point, I was like, I was never meant to hit 90, regardless if I was ready or not. And the point to that setback was for 2 months, me building up like beautifully into 85, 86, which was what that day was supposed to be, turned into me having this massive ego, thinking I knew better than who was writing my program, to which I got massively chewed out for, which I totally deserved it. I totally deserved it. But the matter of the fact was, I lost like 2 months on my end goal, which like I would have been probably throwing live at bats around like month 11, mm-hmm. right? So like, again, it was quote unquote fast, like you guys were saying, but I very much so remember this distinct pain that I had in my elbow after that day. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I just ruined my whole, I was like, I need Tommy John again. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. At what point do you have to like either talk to an athlete, or you went through this yourself saying like, wow, my elbow like really hurts, but you kind of have to be like that comforting friend saying, you're fine. You just did something you weren't supposed to do. You totally outmatched the stress that you weren't prepared for. Mm-hmm. But then also, at what point is it okay to like push past, I'm going to say pain?
Okay. Give me the first part of your question again.
Yeah. The first part of the question is athletes who push past their stress level, mm-hmm. knowing that their arm is hurting, right? At what point do you have to just like reel them back in and say like, hey, things are okay, you were just an idiot?
What I would probably say is that, like, there's not a single return to throw that's probably not going to deal with one version of a setback. In his, it was his hamstring, right? It wasn't related to his throwing arm, but in every single return to throw I've worked with, it's either some random setback not related to throwing, or it is the throwing arm, right? And it can be due to a wide variety of things. There is no mathematical formula that will perfectly predict how you respond to a return to throw, right? You may specifically have a setback at 88 miles an hour. You may specifically have a setback at 60, right? Like in an example scenario. It's about how you navigate through that, right? Are you potentially throwing with a compensatory pattern that's like overstressing the elbow or like shifting stress in a way? A lot of athletes do this in the return to throw. So you might see like a dart throwing pattern that's progressed a little bit too much, where they're really shooting the elbow forward, where they have zero hip shoulder separation, which is, I know, something that you were like harping on early in your return to throw, was like making sure that was staying good. But a lot of athletes, because they're throwing slow for so long, they have like zero hip shoulder separation. They don't sequence well. They don't transfer energy well. So the arm gets a little overstressed. So sometimes it's as simple as actually they're just going back, pulling back, using slow motion video, using mocap, and identifying any movement compensations that are going on. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is we've potentially missed some strength mark. And, you know, with the Flex Pro Grip device that we have now, we've started to really understand that there are specific muscle tendon units in the forearm that have to be at certain strength levels. And a lot of athletes, specifically post Tommy John, have very specific deficits that we've been able to address. Back whenever he was doing, we didn't have the device, but we've identified that now. So now my inclination would be to go look at that, especially if you're having elbow specific pain, would be to strength train or to do a strength test on that device and see if I've missed anything. But sometimes it's just you have a inflammatory response to the stress that you've placed on your body, right? Whether that was too much stress from a single event like your case, or maybe it's just the cumulative stress, or maybe you were getting sick, which raises your inflammatory response overall. The big takeaway from this entire ramble right here is that regardless of the setback that you have, it's about having that conversation with the athlete, realizing that the program is not written in stone, and working with them and working through the adjustments that need to be made in the next 1 to 6 weeks to navigate this bump in the road. And then once you get past it, you do, right? We have Aubrey in gym now who very specifically had a posterior tricep issue for a month and a half. And we troubleshooted 2 to 3 different interventions before we landed on the one that actually stuck. And once we got through that point, it was smooth sailing for him. He was stuck at like 70 miles an hour and getting intense tricep pain and actually losing range of motion. We just identified that it was eventually a tendinopathy and it wasn't anything other than that. And after we treated it and we got the inflammation out, he's fine. I think he just hit like a 94 on a pull down in his most recent plyo velo, which was, you know, the highest he's been in a long time. Yeah. So at what point do we just, you know, have to sit the athlete down and talk them through it? I mean, it's just whenever they're having those setbacks, you know, if everything's smooth sailing, then we just keep progressing with the plan ahead. But whenever they do have the setbacks, it's the partnership, the working with them and giving them the resources and the options that we have, that we can lay out in front of them to try to solve this issue is the key. And a lot of athletes get stuck in limbo land whenever they're doing it at home. Like if you had gone home to your family and you're doing your return to throw back in Michigan, and especially if you're on insurance, you probably wouldn't be seeing your PT very much. You might see them 1 time a week, maybe once every 2 weeks, once you're in that stage with where your insurance is going to provide you. And so you're often just kind of stuck in limbo land if you're having issues and you have no idea what's going on. And that's kind of the benefit of being here, is that like day to day I can work with you. Right. And we can solve those issues. And so like just finding an environment where they're going to help you through that is one thing. To your point about overshooting and feeling way too confident, that's also really where pulse comes in and the velo progressions come in, right? Because if you ignore those, well, then you potentially make that risk, right? But like it's about setting those guardrails, because athletes often feel fantastic during certain parts of their return to throw, and they feel like they can do 100 times more than they should.
Yeah.
Right. And they want to, but that's really where the pulse and the velo comes in, and having those objective volume and intensity prescriptions week after week, day after day, that is building towards a very specific outcome. It sets the guardrails to prevent you from getting a little bit too excited and pushing yourself to that overstress level.
I think to that point, it was last week on Friday, I want to say, and like Josh had just gotten in, like the week of, like Monday or whatever, and I was putting together a tweet exactly of what you said, the 4 like dials: volume, intensity, frequency, and then the undulation of either volume or intensity. And I'm like, Josh, like, I'm looking for this graph of arm speed compared to ball velocity, and like at a certain point, like it would teeter off, whatever. And I go to him, I go, don't look too hard for this, but like if you find this would be like great, so I could obviously show to the public. But the point I'm trying to make here is like, I think what happened was arm speed was progressed to like my max, but ball velocity kept jumping, and so as we continued to progress in ball velocity, I was like, oh, like my arm speed's the same, but the stress continues.
Yeah,
exactly.
There's been a lot of studies looking at like valgus torque, velocity, all this stuff, and basically what they, you can simulate this down to 2 findings: is that between pitchers, like if you throw 90 miles an hour, you throw 90 miles an hour, they're different torques more than likely, but your 45 to 55 to 65 to 75, that progression is relatively linear and consistent with your valgus torque. And it'll continue to increase. Why does pulse cap out at arm speed? It's because whenever you get to the mound, when you get to those max intents, you have all these other factors coming into play. You're on the slope now, so that gives you some linear momentum. You have better sequencing coming into play. So like the arm is still rotating at the same revolutions per minute, but you're transferring so much more energy from the ground up into the ball. And so you don't actually see this increase in arm speed. You see an increase in energy transfer, which, the outcome of that is higher velocity and higher torque as well. So that's really why having both pulse and velocity is kind of the best tag team that you can have for a data-driven program, because pulse is going to be really good early on at those arm speed progressions and kind of normalizing that progression out for everybody. But at the tail end, velocity progressions allow you to avoid that mistake, while pulse then kind of falls into the background and continues to monitor your workload accumulation, which is the other really important component.
And I think there just and correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think the primary thing we do want to progress throughout the return to throw is the actual torque on the arm. The reason we don't use torque as our main value is simply because from what we've found is that arm speed is a little bit more sticky session to session in terms of like sensor placement on your arm. So we've decided that, arm speed is like, it's a little less sensitive to these, like this human error of like placing the pulse sensor wrongly on or incorrectly on your arm.
It's also more digestible.
Like it's also easier to control, right? Like it's easier to tell a guy like, hey, like slow your arm speed down a little bit versus like, hey, like put less torque on your arm. Like, what does that mean? Like,
absolutely.
And then so like that's why we use arm speed as the proxy early on. And then as Luke alluded to, like after arm speed kind of caps out at around like 80% or so of your max velocity, we switch over to velocity as that primary progressor, because velocity becomes a very, very close proxy for how much torque you're actually putting in
your personal torque progression continues with your velocity accumulation. And nobody cares if you throw slow, right? Like that's performance. That's the thing that the return to throw ultimately has to do, is restore your ability to throw at a high intent. And if you and there's been the notion that's been placed out by the medical community that radar guns are just going to make kids throw too hard on the return to throw. That's not true if you give them actual progressions and guidelines
and education.
And education. I've never had an athlete intentionally overshoot once I've explained this to them. You didn't have a velocity. I mean, you being here puts a wrench in that, but you're not my athlete, so that's why.
That's true. Yeah, no, that's true. That's true.
But whenever it comes to the end of that, like that's the only thing that makes you money, right? Is like how hard you're throwing and the stuff that you have. And this is another component of the return to throw is like, there's really two phases. There's the phase that is restoring your ability to throw hard. And then there's the phase that is restoring your ability to be a useful pitcher for somebody.
Sure.
And so that's like your preparatory phase, which is basically your phase 2. And so that's the other component we have to look at progressing is like, if you're a starter, then we need to work on, getting into a similar 5-7 day rotation, whatever, and progressing your single day volume, the amount of volume that you can do in one outing at a peak effort
once a week,
a week versus you are a reliever who might come in 2 days in a row, back to back, maybe even back to back, before you get a day off. And you also have to be able to manage your throwing progression to keep your workload high enough, but also keep you ready to pitch.
It's like the frequency of high intensity.
So your frequency has
like
to
the
be
single day.
Yeah, like you need multiple days in a row of like 20 pitch high efforts and things like that. And so we have to ask those questions at the end of a return to throw phase 1, which is just, okay, you can throw hard again, but like, what's your role as a player? And if you don't prepare the athlete for their role as a player, then that's also another way you can set them up for failure down the road is like,
absolutely.
You go to like, if you had trained like a starter, because that's how a lot of return to throws are laid out in that early stage. It's just one high intent day, but then you go to spring training and you haven't thrown back to back, and your team puts you out on the mound and you have like 4 outings in 8 days. You're probably going to blow up.
And I think that's something I had to be very intentional about at the end of my return to throw, which was, I am expected to be a reliever. I'm expected to probably maybe not back to back in the minors, but 2 out of 3 days or like 2 days rest for sure. And so initially when our return to throw involved 1 high intensity day a week, and we basically had this midweek bullpen that was, so if we threw high intensity Friday and then we threw high intensity the following Friday, we basically had like 2 or 3 days in between this like midweek medium intensity bullpen. And so in the interest of like being game ready as soon as possible, what we basically decided to do was bump up that midweek intensity over the course of a few weeks, as we're saying, like limiting one variable and saying, okay, we're still maintaining my high intensity days on Friday, but we're going to try to make that midweek bullpen, like slowly, gradually get that to a game like intensity. And that basically allowed me to get to feel comfortable throwing every 2 or 3 days.
And then the Mets did a nice progression with you as well.
Exactly.
They were very cognizant of that need as well to get you to give you a pathway to go from like 1 day on, 1 day of rest, 1 day on to like getting you back to back. And so like that aspect was great. Not every athlete gets afforded that. Sometimes they just get thrown to the wolves a little bit. And so that's just something that you have to consider as well. It's just like, how prepared do I need to get the athlete? How much time do I have to do this? And if I am going to progress like that midweek bullpen, what am I going to do on the other days to reorganize the workload to make sure we're not blowing you up?
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's, shifting from more of like a high, medium, low model to just kind of a purely high, low model, and playing with those variables to make sure you're still in a good spot.
We've covered a lot. I want to kind of get your final takeaway, Josh, explicitly, being that you went through what seems like to be a pretty smooth return to throw from like a pretty significant injury. My first question is, where do they take your ligament from? And then my second question is just like, what was like your overall takeaway from your experience with Tommy John?
So they took my ligament from my palmaris.
Okay.
Palmaris longus, is that the correct official name? Palmaris longus on my right arm, which I learned a lot. I asked the doctor, Dr. Alchek, why they take the throwing arm palmaris and not the non-throwing arm. And I think basically because of the repeated stress of throwing over the years, that ligament or that tendon, was it originally a tendon? Is that correct?
Well, I mean, they
so originally was
they
a tendon.
take the tendon,
but that tendon is like I believe more stiff and strong just due to the fact that I've thrown.
Not every surgeon does that, and that's the thing is that depending on the surgeon, you're going to have a different technique. But
that's fair, but that's what he explained to me at least, which I thought was really fascinating. And then I had the full reconstruction and then an internal brace on top of that. So I had the I think Dr. Ahmed with the
Yeah, the one that was
the
just
Yankees
kinda,
is calling it TJ3 now. I think is that what it's called.
Yeah, it's been around for a
It's the
few
same
years, but
idea.
at the highest level, it's only been around. But it's starting to become a little bit more normalized as because you do the reconstruction, which includes taking the tendon, doing the bone graft,
Yep.
And drilling the bone tunnels and all of that. But then they take the newer internal brace and they lay it over the top so that it's even more reinforced.
Makes sense. Yep.
Which allows a little bit of a faster progression.
And then to answer your second question, so I think the biggest takeaway that I've already alluded to is that I think the rehab process is really a time. It's not a time to like take off or to like, like be like, oh, okay, like I can't do anything for a year. Like it's really a time that you can reinvent yourself as an athlete and a pitcher if you take it seriously and you're intentional about what you're doing. And for me, that reflected itself in a few different ways. Number one, I had a conversation with Dylan before the rehab process, and I was basically like, what do you think I need to do as an athlete to like become a better pitcher? And I basically PR'd in every single strength measurement in my arm and in my entire body post TJ because we were very intentional about approaching that. And I think Spencer Strider had a really good quote about this where he basically said when he had TJ, which I think when he was still in college, if I'm not mistaken, but he basically said like he doesn't view Tommy John as like an obstacle that he had to overcome. It's actually the thing that like helped him become who he is as a pitcher.
Yeah.
So it's really a time where you can like really, like I said, reinvent yourself, be extremely intentional about like what you want to be, who the athlete you want to be is, who the pitcher you want to be is, and you can really make some massive adaptations and gains. And more just on a more personal note, obviously playing, baseball for a living is extremely taxing on like, your work-life balance, for example, as an example. But like that time was an extremely valuable time for me to like grow as a human outside of baseball, find my identity as like, I'm not just a baseball player, right? Like I'm a guy who plays baseball, and like, I feel like I reflect my values through baseball, like the things I value, the things I care about, like that expresses itself through baseball. But baseball doesn't define me. Baseball doesn't make me who I am. And like, I think that really set me up for like the rest of my life following baseball. And overall, like, it's just a really valuable experience for me. And and I'm glad I did it here.